In the history of human thought, few thinkers have penetrated as deeply into the mystery of individual existence as Søren Kierkegaard. Born in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1813, this extraordinary philosopher revolutionized how we understand what it means to be truly human. Writing across philosophy, theology, psychology, and social critique, he became what many consider the father of existentialism, developing insights that continue to shape our understanding of faith, freedom, and authentic living more than 150 years after his death. His work emerged during a crucial period when traditional religious certainties were crumbling and modern mass society was beginning to emerge, making his insights remarkably prescient for our own age of rapid change and cultural uncertainty. What makes Kierkegaard unique among philosophers is his relentless focus on concrete individual existence rather than abstract theoretical systems. His mode of philosophizing opposes system building and owes more to the ancients, particularly his hero Socrates, than to the grand systematic thinkers of his era. Unlike contemporaries who sought universal truths through logical reasoning, Kierkegaard asked the most personal question possible. As he wrote in his journal in 1835, "The thing is to find a truth which is true for me, to find the idea for which I can live and die." This exploration will guide you through every major concept that established Kierkegaard as one of history's most influential thinkers. You will discover how his revolutionary ideas about individual choice, anxiety, despair, and authentic existence provide practical wisdom for living meaningfully in an increasingly conformist world. From his critique of mass society and institutional religion, to his analysis of different stages of human development, from his understanding of faith as a leap into the absurd, to his insights about the relationship between time and eternity, we will examine the complete architecture of Kierkegaardian thought. His influence extends from existential psychology and modern theology to contemporary discussions of authenticity and individual responsibility, making him one of the most relevant philosophers for understanding the challenges of modern existence. These concepts remain urgently relevant today, offering guidance for anyone struggling with questions of identity, purpose, and authentic living in our complex modern world, where the very issues Kierkegaard identified have become even more pressing and widespread. Through this comprehensive journey, you will encounter not merely academic philosophy, but transformative insights that can fundamentally change how you understand yourself and your place in the world. Part 1. The Individual Against the Crowd, the Foundation of Authentic Existence. Kierkegaard famously declared that the crowd is untruth. This statement represents one of the most radical and important insights in all of philosophy, challenging the very foundation of how most people live their lives. To understand why Kierkegaard considered the crowd fundamentally opposed to truth and authentic existence, we must first examine what he meant by these terms and why he saw conformity as the greatest threat to human development. This concept forms the bedrock of everything else in his philosophical system. When Kierkegaard spoke of the crowd, he was not merely referring to large groups of people gathered in physical spaces. By crowd, Kierkegaard sociologically means always the man behind whom the eye can hide in the herd. The crowd represents a psychological and spiritual state where individuals surrender their personal responsibility, their unique perspectives, and their capacity for independent thought to the safety and comfort of group consensus. In a crowd, individuals often abandon their own moral judgments and follow the majority, leading to actions that might not align with their true beliefs or values. The crowd operates through what Kierkegaard identified as an insidious process called leveling. Leveling is an anonymous social process, without leaders, in which the uniqueness of the individual becomes non-existent by assigning equal values to all aspects of human endeavours, thus missing all the subtle complexities of human identity. This process reduces all people to the same common denominator, eliminating what makes each person special, distinctive and irreplaceable. It is the victory of abstraction over the individual, where one essentially embodies the crowd rather than developing authentic selfhood. Kierkegaard observed this levelling process with prophetic clarity in his analysis of modern society and the emerging power of mass media. He contrasted the passionate age of revolution with the present age, which is indolent, excessively reflective, apathetic and envy-fueled. One of the problems with the present age is precisely that it is one of levelling, in which genuine excellence is stifled by what Kierkegaard called the monstrous abstraction of the public, an unaccountable phantom created by the press. This public has no face, no name, no personal accountability, yet it claims the authority to determine what is true, valuable and worthwhile. The role of the press and media in creating this phantom public was something Kierkegaard understood with remarkable prescience. The duller the time, the more powerful the press, he observed. The press is the lowest attempt to state consciencelessness as the principle of humanity. He recognized that media creates an artificial sense of collective opinion that individuals then adopt as their own, without ever having personally examined or experienced the truths they claim to believe. This process turns people into what he called spectators of their own lives rather than active participants in authentic existence. Why do people choose the crowd over individual authenticity? Kierkegaard argues that most of us find it too daunting to live as individuals and instead opt for the consolations of the crowd. Most people become quite afraid when each is expected to be a separate individual. The crowd offers safety, certainty, and the comfort of never having to make truly difficult decisions alone. Of course, it is more secure to have a solid position in life, some official appointment which does not demand nearly as much of one. Most people lead far too sheltered lives. But this security comes at an enormous cost. As in the desert one travels in great caravans for fear of robbers and wild beasts, so individuals now have a horror of existence. Only herd by herd do people still dare to live, clinging together in the mass to be something after all. When we surrender our individuality to the crowd, we lose access to our own inner voice, our personal relationship with truth, and our capacity for genuine moral action. We become what Kierkegaard called imitations rather than originals. The crowd operates through a particularly destructive emotion that Kierkegaard called ressentiment. For Kierkegaard, ressentiment means that one blames one's own failures on another person. Individuals who do not conform to the masses are made scapegoats and objects of ridicule by the masses in order to maintain the status quo and to instill into the masses their own sense of superiority. This creates a vicious cycle where anyone who attempts to live authentically becomes a target for the crowd's envy and resentment. The crowd cannot tolerate reminders of what they have given up to achieve their false security. Against this backdrop of crowd conformity, Kierkegaard proposed the ideal of the single individual. Kierkegaard used the term single individual to describe what he saw as the subjectivity of each person's experience. The single individual is someone who has chosen to separate themselves from the crowd's influence and take full responsibility for their own existence. This person recognizes that truth cannot be determined by majority vote or popular opinion, but must be discovered through personal experience and individual commitment. Truth always rests with the minority, and the minority is always stronger than the majority because the minority is generally formed by those who really have an opinion, while the strength of a majority is illusory, formed by the gangs who have no opinion. This insight reveals why authentic individuals often find themselves in opposition to prevailing social trends and popular beliefs. They are not contrarian for its own sake, but because they have taken the time and effort to develop genuine convictions based on their own experience rather than accepting pre-packaged opinions from others. The process of becoming a single individual requires what Kierkegaard considered the highest human capacity, the ability to be alone. The yardstick for a human being is how long and to what degree he can bear to be alone, devoid of understanding with others. A man who can bear being alone during a whole lifetime and alone in decisions of eternal significance is farthest removed from the infant and the society person. This aloneness is not isolation or withdrawal from human contact, but rather the spiritual independence necessary to make authentic choices without needing constant validation from others. Kierkegaard understood that his emphasis on the individual might be misinterpreted as selfish individualism or antisocial behavior, but his concern was precisely the opposite. He believed that only authentic individuals could contribute genuinely to society and love their neighbours properly. As he wrote, "Never have I read in the Holy Scriptures this command, 'You shall love the crowd,' even less, 'You shall ethico-religiously recognize in the crowd the court of last resort in relation to the truth.' One cannot truly love humanity in the abstract. Love requires personal relationships with particular individuals." The individual's relationship to eternal truth was central to Kierkegaard's vision. The eternal, the decisive, can only be worked for where there is one. And to become this by oneself, which all can do, is to will to allow God to help you. The crowd is untruth. This highlights why individual authenticity was not merely a philosophical preference for Kierkegaard, but a spiritual necessity. He believed that each person has a unique relationship with the eternal that cannot be mediated through collective institutions or social consensus. The practical implications of choosing individual authenticity over crowd conformity are significant and often difficult. A true martyrdom is where one has to deal with the crowd. The authentic individual must be prepared to face misunderstanding, criticism and isolation from those who have chosen the safety of conformity. They must develop the inner strength to maintain their convictions even when surrounded by people who think differently or who actively oppose their choices. Yet Kierkegaard believed this path of individual authenticity was not only possible but essential for human flourishing. Individuals who navigate life guided by their own values rather than the crowd's are likely to experience a greater sense of purpose and satisfaction. They are also better positioned to contribute positively to society, offering fresh perspectives and innovations that originate from a place of authenticity. The single individual becomes a source of renewal and truth in a world increasingly dominated by abstract conformity and levelling. The crowd is indeed untruth, but the individual who chooses authenticity over conformity opens themselves to the possibility of discovering what is most true and valuable in human existence. Part 2. The 3 stages of existence, a journey through human development. One of Kierkegaard's most influential contributions to understanding human development is his analysis of what he called the 3 stages on life's way. These stages represent 3 fundamentally different approaches to existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. Unlike developmental psychology, which describes natural progressions, Kierkegaard's stages are competing worldviews that require conscious choice and spiritual transformation to navigate. Understanding these stages reveals the architecture of human growth and the possibility of authentic existence. The aesthetic stage represents the most immediate and widespread approach to human existence. This stage is characterized by a focus on pleasure, beauty, and immediate gratifications of desires without concern for the consequences of one's actions or the impact on others. The aesthetic individual lives entirely in the present moment, seeking novel experiences and avoiding boredom at all costs. Their primary concern is what Kierkegaard called the interesting, the pursuit of experiences that stimulate and entertain without demanding deeper commitment or responsibility. The aesthetic life might appear attractive on the surface, especially to young people discovering their freedom and possibilities. In this stage, one is free to explore and experiment without the constraints of responsibility or commitment. It is a time of passion, sensuality, and aesthetic appreciation where one seeks pleasure and enjoyment in all aspects of life. The aesthetic person treats life like a work of art, constantly arranging experiences to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. They avoid anything that might tie them down or limit their options for future experiences. However, Kierkegaard identified fundamental problems with the aesthetic approach to life. The aesthetic individual lacks any coherent framework for making consistent choices because their decisions are based entirely on immediate desires and momentary impulses. Eventually, the pleasures of the aesthetic wear thin, and one must begin seeking something more substantial. The aesthetic lifestyle inevitably leads to boredom, emptiness, and what Kierkegaard called despair, though the aesthetic person may not recognize their condition as such. The limitations of the aesthetic stage become apparent when we consider its essential selfishness. The aesthetic individual is concerned only with their personal enjoyment and cannot do something solely for the good of someone else. They lack the capacity for genuine self-sacrifice or commitment to anything beyond their own immediate satisfaction. This creates a profound isolation, as authentic relationships require the ability to consider others' needs and to maintain commitments even when they become difficult or boring. The aesthetic person remains trapped in a cycle of seeking ever greater stimulation while becoming increasingly disconnected from meaningful human connection. When the crisis of the aesthetic stage becomes unbearable, some individuals transition to the ethical stage. The ethical stage represents a higher form of existence than the aesthetic, focused on duty, responsibility, and universal moral principles. The ethical person commits to moral laws and accepts responsibility for their actions. They might get married, pursue a career, and fulfill their obligations to society. This stage provides the structure and meaning that the aesthetic stage lacks, offering a framework for making consistent decisions based on principles rather than impulses. Judge William, one of Kierkegaard's pseudonymous characters, represents the ethical stage in its fullest development. He advocates for marriage as the supreme ethical choice, arguing that through commitment the self acquires temporal continuity and the sensuous is raised to the level of spirit. The ethical person finds meaning through fulfilling universal duties and living according to social expectations. They derive satisfaction from doing what is right rather than merely what feels good, and they accept the burdens of responsibility as the price of meaningful existence. The ethical stage offers certain pleasures that the aesthetic life cannot provide. An aesthetic individual can never experience the deep satisfaction that comes from self-sacrifice for others or from maintaining commitments through difficult times. The ethical person discovers that doing things for others without personal motives can actually be incredibly fulfilling. They experience the joy of building lasting relationships and contributing to something larger than themselves. However, Kierkegaard argued that even the ethical stage has profound limitations. Universal moral laws cannot address every situation, and sometimes following established rules can lead to internal conflict and guilt. The ethical person eventually faces situations where moral duty alone is not enough to provide guidance or meaning. They may discover that rigid adherence to social expectations can become its own form of conformity, limiting their ability to respond to unique circumstances or to develop a personal relationship with the divine. The most serious limitation of the ethical stage is its tendency to equate socialization with salvation. The ethical person assumes that following universal moral principles automatically leads to the highest form of human development. But Kierkegaard recognized that even the most morally upright individual can remain spiritually empty if their obedience to ethical rules is merely external compliance rather than authentic commitment. The ethical stage, while superior to the aesthetic, can become another form of hiding in the crowd, this time the crowd of moral respectability. This crisis within the ethical stage can lead to the highest form of human existence, the religious stage. The religious stage represents a fundamental transformation where the individual develops a personal relationship with God that transcends both aesthetic pleasure and ethical duty. This stage requires what Kierkegaard called the leap of faith, a passionate commitment that goes beyond what can be proven through reason or justified through universal moral principles. The religious individual recognizes that their ultimate accountability is not to social expectations or abstract moral laws, but to God as the absolute authority over their existence. In the religious stage, the individual achieves what Kierkegaard considered the highest purpose of human life. This is not merely conventional religiosity or social respectability, but a deeply personal and transformative relationship with the divine. The religious person understands that human reason and moral effort alone are insufficient for complete development. They recognize their fundamental need for divine grace and transcendence to a higher power that provides ultimate meaning and purpose. Importantly, Kierkegaard did not see these stages as naturally sequential or automatically progressive. It is entirely possible to live one's entire life in the aesthetic stage, constantly seeking pleasure and avoiding responsibility. Many people achieve ethical respectability, but never move beyond social conformity to genuine religious faith. The transitions between stages require conscious choice and often involve significant struggle and crisis. Moreover, the later stages do not simply replace the earlier ones, but rather transform and integrate them. The religious person does not cease to appreciate beauty or abandon moral responsibility, but rather places these concerns in proper relationship to their ultimate commitment to God. Each stage contains insights and values that remain important throughout human development. The key is achieving proper perspective and priority, with the religious relationship providing the foundation that gives meaning to aesthetic enjoyment and ethical commitment. Part 3. Anxiety and the concept of dread, the dizziness of freedom. Kierkegaard identified anxiety as one of the most fundamental aspects of human existence, developing what would become one of the most influential psychological and philosophical concepts in modern thought. Unlike fear, which has a specific object that we can identify and address, anxiety emerges from our awareness of freedom and possibility. This anxiety reveals both the blessing and curse of human existence. We are free to choose our destiny, but this freedom comes with overwhelming responsibility and uncertainty. Understanding Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety provides crucial insight into what it means to be authentically human. Anxiety must be clearly distinguished from ordinary fear to understand its deeper significance. Fear is a person's concern about what threatens him from outside, from the myriad threats to life, limb, livelihood and happiness over which he has limited control. Anxiety, on the other hand, is a person's concern about what threatens him from inside, from within his own consciousness. An anxious person is concerned about what he might choose to do, given his freedom to choose. He is troubled by his own freedom and spontaneity. Kierkegaard presents anxiety as freedom's actuality, as the possibility of possibility. He uses the powerful example of a man standing at the edge of a cliff to illustrate this concept. When this person looks over the edge, he experiences two different kinds of fear. The obvious fear of accidentally falling to his death, and a more disturbing anxiety arising from the realization that he is completely free to jump if he chooses. This second type of anxiety comes from recognizing his absolute freedom to make even the most terrifying decisions. This is what Kierkegaard called the dizziness of freedom. Just as physical dizziness makes us lose our balance and sense of orientation, anxiety emerges when we become aware of the boundless possibilities before us and our complete responsibility for choosing among them. We experience this dizziness because we realize that we have the alarming possibility of being able to choose our own destruction or salvation. This awareness of our radical freedom creates a profound vertigo that can be both terrifying and exhilarating. Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety begins with the biblical story of Adam in the Garden of Eden. Before eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Adam lived in a state of innocence where the concepts of good and evil had no meaning for him. But when God commanded Adam not to eat from the tree, this prohibition introduced the possibility of choice and disobedience. According to Kierkegaard, anxiety preceded Adam's sin because it arose from his awareness of freedom rather than from any actual wrongdoing. This original anxiety represents a crucial moment in human development. Anxiety is not itself sin, but is the natural reaction of the soul when faced with the yawning abyss of freedom. When we become self-conscious and aware of our possibilities, we also become aware that we could choose wrongly. This awareness generates anxiety because we realize that our choices have consequences and that we bear full responsibility for the direction of our lives. Kierkegaard's understanding of anxiety emerged with the birth of self-consciousness. In our childhood state, growth entails actualizing latent potentials with little to no conscious reflection or choice on our part. At a certain stage in development, we awaken to self-consciousness. Or symbolically speaking, we eat the forbidden fruit of knowledge and become aware not only of good and evil, but of the possibility of freedom. We start to fathom the innumerable possibilities before us and see how the pursuit of each one would open a door into a different unknown. This awareness of freedom in the midst of infinite possibilities generates the characteristic anxiety of human existence. Unlike animals, who are guided by instinct, or machines, which are programmed, humans must choose who they become and what they believe. This freedom makes authentic existence possible, but it also creates the possibility of choosing poorly, or refusing to choose at all. We stand before the future like someone at the edge of an abyss, simultaneously attracted by the power our choices give us, and repelled by the demands and confusion they impose. But Kierkegaard saw anxiety as more than just an unfortunate byproduct of human freedom. He argued that anxiety is essential for authentic human development and creativity. Learning to know anxiety is an adventure which every man has to affront if he would not go to perdition either by not having known anxiety or by sinking under it. The person who has learned rightly to be anxious has learned the most important thing. Anxiety forces us to confront our freedom and responsibility, preventing us from living in unconscious conformity or complacent routine. Anxiety serves as freedom's possibility, and only such anxiety is through faith absolutely educative, because it consumes all finite ends and discovers all their deceptiveness. Through anxiety we become aware not only of our potential for growth and achievement, but also of our capacity for self-destruction and moral failure. This awareness can be overwhelming, but it is also what makes genuine choice and authentic development possible. Without anxiety, we would remain trapped in unconscious routine, never fully awakening to our potential or our responsibility. The relationship between anxiety and creativity is particularly important in Kierkegaard's understanding, because it is possible to creating oneself, willing to be oneself, as well as creating in all the innumerable daily activities. One has anxiety. But creating also means destroying the status quo of one's environment, breaking old forms and producing something new and original. Thus, every experience of creativity has its potential for aggression or denial toward other persons in one's environment or established patterns within oneself. This connection between anxiety and creativity reveals why Kierkegaard believed that the more creative the person, the more anxiety and guilt are potentially present. To create something genuinely new requires the courage to break with existing patterns and to risk failure, criticism, or misunderstanding. The anxiety we feel when contemplating creative work reflects our awareness that creation requires destruction of what came before. In every experience of creativity, something in the past is killed so that something new in the present may be born. However, anxiety can also become destructive when we try to flee from our freedom rather than embrace it. If we decide to escape from our freedom in an attempt to rid ourselves of anxiety, avoiding the possibilities that lie before us, we will succumb to despair. A life without possibilities and freedom is sterile, breeds stagnation, and rids us of hope for a better future. Therefore, since possibility and freedom are only possible with anxiety present, we must learn to be anxious in the right way, rather than trying to eliminate anxiety altogether. The challenge is learning to live with anxiety without being overwhelmed by it. We are forced into a difficult choice, anxiety or depression. If we move forward, as our soul insists, we may be flooded with anxiety. If we do not move forward, we will suffer the depression, the pressing down of the soul's purpose. The key is developing the strength to tolerate anxiety while continuing to make authentic choices. This requires what Kierkegaard called faith, the courage to act decisively despite uncertainty about the outcomes of our choices. Ultimately, Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety reveals the fundamental structure of human existence. We are creatures suspended between finitude and infinity, necessity and possibility, time and eternity. Anxiety emerges from this suspension, this lack of solid ground on which to stand with complete certainty. But rather than seeing this as a flaw in human design, Kierkegaard understood anxiety as the price and privilege of authentic existence. It is precisely because we can feel anxious that we can also experience genuine freedom, creativity, and spiritual growth. Part 4. Faith and the Leap Beyond Reason into the Absurd. For Kierkegaard, faith represents the highest and most challenging aspect of human existence, requiring what he called the leap into the absurd. This leap cannot be made through reason, logical argument, or gradual progression from ethical behavior. Instead, faith demands a passionate, subjective commitment that goes beyond what can be proven or understood through rational analysis. Understanding Kierkegaard's concept of faith reveals why he considered it both the most important and most difficult achievement in human life. Faith begins precisely where thinking leaves off. This statement captures the fundamental paradox at the heart of Kierkegaard's understanding of religious commitment. While reason can analyze, compare, and systematize, it cannot bridge the gap between finite human understanding and infinite divine reality. Faith requires abandoning the safety of rational certainty and embracing what appears impossible, unreasonable, or even absurd from a purely human perspective. The concept of the absurd is central to Kierkegaard's analysis of faith. The absurd is not simply something that is illogical or contradictory, but rather something that transcends the categories of human reason altogether. For Kierkegaard, the ultimate absurdity is the Christian claim that the eternal, infinite, transcendent God became incarnated as a finite human being in time. From reason's perspective, this is an offense, something that cannot be comprehended or systematized within any philosophical framework. This offense to reason is not accidental, but essential to the nature of faith. If religious truth could be demonstrated through logical argument or scientific method, it would no longer require faith, but would become simply another form of knowledge. The very impossibility of proving God's existence or demonstrating the truth of religious claims is what makes faith necessary and what gives it its distinctive character. Faith exists precisely because we must believe without objective certainty or rational proof. Kierkegaard distinguished between two fundamentally different approaches to truth, objective and subjective. Objective truth focuses on facts that can be proven, measured, and verified independently of the person investigating them. Subjective truth, by contrast, concerns the relationship between the individual and what they believe. For matters of ultimate importance, especially religious faith, subjective truth becomes more significant than objective proof. The question for faith is not whether you can prove that God exists, but whether you live as if God exists. This shift from objective demonstration to subjective appropriation transforms the entire nature of religious commitment. Faith becomes not a matter of intellectual assent to propositions that have been proven true, but a passionate engagement with ultimate questions that require personal risk and commitment. The believer must stake their entire existence on something that cannot be objectively verified. This emphasis on subjectivity led Kierkegaard to his famous declaration that truth is subjectivity. He did not mean that facts are relative or that everyone creates their own reality. Instead, he argued that the most important truths about human existence cannot be approached through detached scientific analysis. They require passionate personal engagement and commitment that transforms the believer in the very act of believing. Kierkegaard identified two different types of reflection that correspond to these different approaches to truth. Objective reflection seeks to understand things from a neutral, universal perspective, treating the thinker as a detached observer. Subjective reflection acknowledges that the thinker is personally involved in what they are thinking about. When it comes to questions of meaning, purpose, and faith, subjective reflection provides the only path to authentic understanding because these questions cannot be answered without personal commitment. The leap of faith represents the moment when an individual abandons the attempt to achieve rational certainty and commits themselves completely to what they cannot prove. This leap is not arbitrary or irrational in the sense of being random or thoughtless. Rather, it is a passionate decision, made in full awareness of the risks involved and the impossibility of objective guarantee. The person making the leap understands that they could be wrong, but they choose to believe anyway because the stakes are so high and the potential reward so great. Kierkegaard emphasized that this leap cannot be made gradually or partially. Faith is not something that can be achieved through incremental steps or logical progression. Either one makes the leap completely, abandoning reliance on rational proof, or one remains in the sphere of objective uncertainty. There is no middle ground between faith and doubt, no way to ease into religious commitment while maintaining rational security. The leap of faith also involves what Kierkegaard called the teleological suspension of the ethical. This means that genuine religious commitment may require going beyond or even against universal moral principles when they conflict with divine command. The person of faith recognizes that God's authority transcends human moral systems and social expectations. This creates a profound tension, as the believer must be prepared to act in ways that cannot be justified to others or understood within conventional ethical frameworks. This suspension of the ethical does not mean that faith is immoral or that religious people are free to ignore moral obligations. Rather, it means that when ultimate religious commitments conflict with conventional morality, the person of faith must be willing to follow the higher authority. This requires enormous courage and spiritual maturity, as well as the ability to distinguish between authentic divine calling and mere personal preference or fanaticism. The person making this choice bears full responsibility for their decision and cannot appeal to rational argument or social consensus for justification. The passion involved in faith is crucial to Kierkegaard's understanding. Faith is not a cool, detached intellectual position, but a passionate commitment that engages the whole person. This passion drives humans to seek reality and truth in a transcendent world, even though everything we can know intellectually speaks against it. To live and die for a belief, to stake everything one has and is in the belief in something that has a higher meaning than anything in the world. This is belief and passion at their highest. Yet Kierkegaard recognized that faith must be continually renewed and chosen again and again. It is not a decision made once and then maintained automatically, but a constant choice to believe despite ongoing uncertainty and doubt. The person of faith does not achieve a state of permanent security, but must daily choose to live as if their ultimate commitments are true. This ongoing choice requires what Kierkegaard called repetition, the ability to maintain faithful commitment while continuing to grow and develop. The difficulty of faith explains why Kierkegaard believed it to be so rare and precious. Most people prefer the security of rational knowledge or ethical respectability to the risk and uncertainty of genuine religious commitment. They want to believe but are unwilling to make the leap that genuine faith requires. For Kierkegaard, this explains why true Christianity is so uncommon, even in societies that consider themselves Christian. The majority of people settle for conventional religiosity rather than risking the leap into authentic faith. Part 5. The Knight of Faith, Abraham as the model of ultimate commitment. In his masterwork Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard presents Abraham as the ultimate example of what he calls the Knight of Faith. Through analyzing the biblical story of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac, Kierkegaard explores the highest form of religious existence and the paradoxes that define authentic faith. This analysis reveals not only what faith means in its purest form, but also why such faith is so rare and difficult to achieve. The Knight of Faith represents the culmination of human spiritual development, yet remains a figure that most people cannot understand or emulate. The story of Abraham and Isaac presents what appears to be an impossible moral situation. When God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son, Abraham faces a choice that cannot be resolved through normal ethical reasoning. From any conventional moral perspective, killing one's child is absolutely wrong, the most fundamental violation of parental duty and human decency. Yet Abraham believes that God's command transcends ordinary ethical categories and demands obedience even when it conflicts with universal moral principles. Kierkegaard contrasts Abraham with what he calls the tragic hero, represented by figures like Agamemnon, who sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia for the sake of the Greek cause. The tragic hero makes a terrible choice, but one that can be understood and even admired within ethical frameworks. Agamemnon sacrifices his personal desires for a higher duty that serves the universal good. His action, while painful, makes sense within the moral system of his time and can be explained and justified to others. Abraham's situation is fundamentally different and more challenging. He cannot appeal to any universal principle or social good to justify his intended action. If anything, sacrificing Isaac would destroy the very promise through which God had pledged to make Abraham the father of many nations. Abraham's willingness to obey God's command cannot be understood through ethical reasoning and cannot be communicated to others in rational terms. This incommunicability is essential to the nature of the Knight of Faith. Abraham is entirely alone and cannot justify his actions to anyone, including his wife Sarah or his son Isaac. He cannot explain why he is taking Isaac to Mount Moriah or why God would demand such a terrible sacrifice. The Knight of Faith exists in pure isolation and cannot make their deepest commitments comprehensible to others because these commitments transcend the realm of ordinary human discourse. Yet Abraham's faith involves more than simple resignation to God's will. Kierkegaard distinguishes between the Knight of infinite resignation and the Knight of Faith, both of which Abraham exemplifies. As a knight of infinite resignation, Abraham is prepared to give up everything he values most in the world, accepting that God has the right to demand whatever God chooses. But as a knight of faith, Abraham goes beyond resignation to believe that God will somehow restore what has been sacrificed. This dual movement creates the essential paradox of Abraham's faith. Even as he genuinely prepares to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham simultaneously believes that he will receive Isaac back again. This belief cannot be based on rational calculation or past experience, since nothing in human knowledge suggests that God restores what has been offered in sacrifice. Abraham believes by virtue of the absurd, maintaining impossible hope even while genuinely prepared to fulfill God's command. The paradox becomes even more complex when we consider Abraham's relationship to time and possibility. Abraham does not believe that God will eventually provide a substitute sacrifice or change his mind about requiring Isaac's death. Rather, Abraham believes that somehow, even if he goes through with killing Isaac, God will restore his son to him. This belief defies not only reason but also the basic laws of nature and human experience. Yet this impossible faith is precisely what makes Abraham the father of faith and the model for all authentic religious commitment. Abraham's willingness to act on God's command, despite its apparent contradiction of everything he values, demonstrates the ultimate priority of divine authority over human understanding. His simultaneous belief in restoration, despite all evidence to the contrary, shows faith's power to transcend the limitations of finite human perspective. Abraham becomes great not through ethical virtue, but through this purely personal and inexplicable relationship with God. The Knight of Faith differs fundamentally from both the aesthetic individual and the ethical person. Unlike the aesthetic person, the Knight of Faith is not seeking personal pleasure or immediate gratification. Unlike the ethical person, the Knight of Faith does not derive meaning from fulfilling universal moral duties or social expectations. Instead, the Knight of Faith finds ultimate meaning in a direct personal relationship with God that may require going beyond both aesthetic pleasure and ethical duty. Paradoxically, the Knight of Faith appears completely ordinary from the outside. Unlike the tragic hero, who is recognizably great through their sacrifice and suffering, the Knight of Faith blends seamlessly into everyday life. They fulfill their worldly duties, maintain their relationships, and participate in social life without any external sign of their extraordinary faith. Only they themselves and God know the depth of their commitment and the radical nature of their inner relationship to the Absolute. This hiddenness is not accidental, but essential to the nature of mature faith. The Knight of Faith does not need external recognition or validation because their relationship with God provides complete meaning and security. They can enjoy worldly pleasures and fulfill social responsibilities without being ultimately dependent on them for meaning. Having made the leap into faith, they live simultaneously in time and eternity, finite and infinite, particular and universal. The Knight of Faith also demonstrates what Kierkegaard called repetition, the ability to receive back what has been sacrificed. Abraham receives Isaac back, but Isaac is no longer merely the son of his natural affection, but also the gift of divine grace. This restoration does not eliminate the reality of the sacrifice, but transforms its meaning. The Knight of Faith learns that genuine commitment to God does not require abandoning worldly goods and relationships, but rather receiving them back in their proper perspective. However, Kierkegaard was clear that becoming a Knight of Faith is extraordinarily difficult and rare. Most people lack the courage to make the leap into genuine faith, preferring the security of rational knowledge or ethical respectability. Even those who desire faith often settle for conventional religiosity rather than risking the isolation and uncertainty that authentic faith requires. The Knight of Faith represents an ideal that challenges comfortable religious assumptions and demands nothing less than complete transformation of one's relationship to existence. Kierkegaard himself admitted uncertainty about whether he possessed the faith he described through Abraham's example. Writing under the pseudonym Johannes de Silentio, he presents himself as someone who admires Abraham but cannot fully understand or emulate him. This humility reflects Kierkegaard's recognition that genuine faith cannot be achieved through philosophical analysis or personal effort alone. The Knight of Faith represents a gift of grace that transforms human existence in ways that cannot be predicted, controlled, or fully comprehended by those who receive it. Part 6. Subjective Truth versus Objective Truth, the heart of authentic knowledge. One of Kierkegaard's most revolutionary contributions to philosophy was his challenge to the traditional emphasis on objective truth and his development of the concept of subjective truth. This distinction fundamentally changed how we understand the relationship between knowledge and existence, revealing why the most important truths about human life cannot be approached through detached scientific analysis. Understanding this distinction provides crucial insight into Kierkegaard's entire philosophical project and his critique of both academic philosophy and conventional Christianity. It also reveals why authentic knowledge requires personal engagement rather than neutral observation. Objective truth represents the traditional philosophical ideal of knowledge that is universal, verifiable, and independent of the particular circumstances or perspectives of the knower. This type of truth focuses on facts that can be proven and measured through rational analysis, scientific investigation, or logical demonstration. Objective knowledge seeks to eliminate personal bias, individual perspective, and subjective involvement in order to achieve neutral, universal validity. The goal is to discover truths that would be equally valid for any rational being, regardless of their personal background or individual circumstances. Kierkegaard did not reject the validity of objective truth within its proper sphere. For questions about the natural world, mathematical relationships, or historical facts, objective investigation provides valuable and necessary knowledge. The problem arises when this approach is applied to questions of ultimate meaning, personal existence, and religious faith. These questions cannot be answered through detached observation because they inherently involve the whole person, including their values, commitments, and life choices. Subjective truth, by contrast, concerns the relationship between the individual and what they believe or value. This type of truth is not arbitrary or relative, but rather recognizes that certain kinds of knowledge can only be gained through passionate, personal engagement. Subjective truth acknowledges that the most important questions about human existence cannot be separated from the person asking them. The truth of religious faith, moral commitment, or personal meaning depends not only on what is believed, but also on how it is believed and how it transforms the believer's existence. Kierkegaard's famous statement that truth is subjectivity does not mean that facts are merely matters of opinion, or that individuals can create their own reality. Instead, it means that for questions of ultimate importance, the manner of believing becomes more significant than the content of belief. A person who passionately commits themselves to something that cannot be objectively proven may achieve greater truth than someone who merely acknowledges facts without personal engagement. The intensity and authenticity of subjective commitment can reveal truths about existence that remain hidden from purely objective analysis. This emphasis on subjectivity emerged from Kierkegaard's critique of the philosophical systems of his time, particularly those of Hegel and other German idealists. These philosophers attempted to construct comprehensive rational systems that would explain all of reality through logical analysis. Kierkegaard argued that such systems inevitably miss what is most important about human existence because they treat individuals as mere examples of universal categories rather than as unique existing persons. Real human life involves struggle, decision, commitment, and uncertainty that cannot be captured in abstract philosophical systems. The distinction between objective and subjective truth becomes particularly important when applied to religious questions. Traditional apologetics attempts to prove God's existence through rational arguments or historical evidence, treating religious belief as a form of objective knowledge. Kierkegaard argued that this approach fundamentally misunderstands the nature of faith. Even if it were possible to prove God's existence objectively, such proof would actually eliminate the need for faith and transform religion into merely another form of scientific knowledge. Instead, Religious truth requires what Kierkegaard called passionate intensity of subjective commitment. The question is not whether you can demonstrate that God exists, but whether you live as if God exists with complete dedication and trust. This transforms faith from intellectual assent to propositions into passionate engagement with ultimate reality. The believer must risk their entire existence on something that cannot be objectively verified, and this risk is essential to the nature of authentic faith. Kierkegaard illustrated this principle through his analysis of different approaches to Christianity. Someone who has only objective knowledge about Christian doctrine may understand all the theological details without ever experiencing genuine faith. By contrast, someone who knows very little about theology but lives with passionate commitment to Christ may achieve deeper religious truth. The difference lies not in the amount of information possessed, but in the quality and intensity of personal appropriation. This insight applies beyond religious questions to all matters of personal existence and meaning. Questions about how to live, what to value, and what constitutes a meaningful life cannot be answered through detached analysis. These questions require personal engagement, experimentation, and commitment that transform the questioner in the process of seeking answers. The truth of moral principles, aesthetic values, or life purposes can only be discovered by those willing to risk living according to their convictions. Kierkegaard distinguished between two types of reflection that correspond to these different approaches to truth. Objective reflection seeks to understand things from a neutral, universal perspective that eliminates the personal element. Subjective reflection acknowledges that the thinker is personally involved in what they are investigating and that this involvement affects both the process and the results of inquiry. For questions of existence and meaning, subjective reflection is not a limitation to be overcome, but a necessary condition for achieving authentic understanding. The development of subjective truth requires what Kierkegaard called inwardness, the deepening of personal commitment, and the intensification of passionate engagement with ultimate questions. This inwardness cannot be achieved through external accumulation of knowledge or social recognition. Instead, it develops through the individual's willingness to stake their existence on their deepest convictions and to live with the uncertainty that such commitment requires. The more intense the inwardness, the greater the subjective truth, regardless of whether the individual's beliefs can be objectively demonstrated. This emphasis on subjective truth also explains Kierkegaard's use of indirect communication and pseudonymous authorship. If the most important truths cannot be communicated directly like scientific facts, then the communicator must find ways to provoke readers into their own subjective engagement with ultimate questions. Rather than presenting conclusions to be accepted, Kierkegaard creates situations that force readers to make their own choices and commitments. The truth of his insights can only be discovered by those willing to engage with them personally, rather than merely understanding them intellectually. However, Kierkegaard's emphasis on subjective truth does not lead to relativism or the denial of objective standards. He maintained that some subjective commitments are more authentic and valuable than others, and that genuine subjectivity involves accountability to something beyond personal preference. The highest form of subjective truth involves relationship with God as absolute truth, which provides an objective standard even while requiring subjective appropriation. This creates a paradox. The most subjective truth is simultaneously the most objective because it involves relationship with absolute reality rather than merely human opinion. Part 7. Despair and the Sickness unto Death, the Human Condition Revealed. Kierkegaard's analysis of despair and the sickness unto death represents one of the most penetrating psychological and spiritual diagnoses in all of philosophy. This work reveals despair not as a temporary emotional state, but as a fundamental condition of human existence that affects everyone, regardless of their awareness of it. Understanding Kierkegaard's concept of despair provides crucial insight into what he saw as the universal human predicament and the path toward authentic selfhood. This analysis remains remarkably relevant for understanding contemporary issues of identity, meaning, and mental health. Despair, according to Kierkegaard, is not simply feeling sad, depressed, or discouraged about particular circumstances. Instead, despair represents a fundamental misrelation of the self to itself, a spiritual sickness that affects the very structure of human existence. To understand this concept, we must first examine Kierkegaard's analysis of what constitutes the human self. According to his famous definition, the self is a relation that relates itself to itself, and in relating itself to itself, relates itself to another. This complex formulation reveals that human beings are not simple, unified entities, but rather exist as a synthesis of opposing elements. Humans are composed of necessity and possibility, finite and infinite, temporal and eternal. We exist in constant tension between what we must be and what we might become, between our limitations and our aspirations, between our immediate circumstances and our ultimate destiny. The self emerges from the ongoing task of synthesizing these opposing elements into a coherent existence. Despair occurs when this synthesis fails or becomes unbalanced. A person might lose themselves in immediate necessities and forget their infinite possibilities, becoming trapped in routine and convention without any sense of transcendent purpose. Alternatively, they might become lost in abstract possibilities and neglect their finite limitations, living in fantasy and avoiding concrete responsibilities. Both forms represent a failure to achieve authentic selfhood through proper integration of the different aspects of human existence. What makes Kierkegaard's analysis particularly profound is his recognition that most despair is unconscious. The most dangerous form of despair is not knowing that you are in despair. Many people live their entire lives in this unconscious despair, following routines and social expectations without ever becoming authentic individuals. They avoid the anxiety of freedom by refusing to acknowledge their responsibility for their own existence, creating what appears to be a successful and happy life while remaining spiritually empty. This unconscious despair manifests in various forms of inauthentic existence. Some people lose themselves in what Kierkegaard called immediacy, living entirely for present pleasures and avoiding any deeper reflection about meaning or purpose. Others become absorbed in social roles and external achievements, defining themselves entirely through their reputation, career success, or social status. Still others retreat into abstract intellectualism, treating life as a philosophical problem to be solved rather than an existence to be lived. Kierkegaard identified three primary forms of despair based on the level of consciousness and will involved. The first form is despair that is unconscious of being despair, where the person has no awareness of their spiritual condition. The second form is despair that is conscious of being despair, but does not will to be itself, representing the person who recognizes their condition but attempts to escape through distraction or denial. The third and most serious form is despair that is conscious of being despair and wills to be itself, representing the person who defiantly chooses despair as a form of self-assertion against God and existence. The progression through these forms reveals increasing consciousness but also increasing danger. While unconscious despair is spiritually deadening, conscious despair at least represents an awakening to one's actual condition. However, the person who consciously chooses despair commits what Kierkegaard saw as the most serious spiritual offence, the deliberate rejection of authentic selfhood. This represents not mere weakness or ignorance, but active rebellion against the conditions of human existence. Central to Kierkegaard's analysis is the recognition that despair is fundamentally a spiritual, rather than merely a psychological condition. While despair may manifest through emotional symptoms that resemble clinical depression, its root cause lies in the human being's relationship to God and to their own eternal destiny. The self that relates itself to itself must also relate itself to the power that constituted it, which for Kierkegaard means God. Despair ultimately results from the attempt to be a self without acknowledging this fundamental dependence on divine power. This spiritual dimension explains why worldly success, pleasure, or even ethical respectability cannot cure despair. A person may achieve everything they desire in terms of wealth, reputation, or social approval while remaining in fundamental despair about their existence. Conversely, someone who appears unsuccessful or troubled by worldly standards may achieve authentic selfhood and freedom from despair through proper relationship with God. The cure for despair lies not in changing external circumstances, but in transforming one's fundamental orientation toward existence itself. Kierkegaard's analysis also reveals why despair is universal to human existence. Just as a physician might say that there is not one single living human being who is completely healthy, so anyone who really knows mankind might say there is not one single living human being who does not secretly harbour an unrest, an inner strife, a disharmony, an anxiety about an unknown something. This universality stems from the structure of human existence itself, which requires each person to achieve authentic selfhood through their own choices and commitments. The very possibility of authentic existence creates the possibility of failing to achieve it. The relationship between despair and sin is also crucial to Kierkegaard's analysis. Despair and sin are fundamentally the same condition viewed from different perspectives. Sin represents the religious category for what psychologically appears as despair. Both involve the fundamental misrelation of the self to itself and to God, manifesting as the attempt to be a self on one's own terms, rather than accepting the conditions under which authentic selfhood is possible. However, Kierkegaard's diagnosis comes with hope for healing. The opposite of despair is not happiness or success, but faith. Faith represents the achievement of authentic selfhood through proper relationship with God and acceptance of one's existence as both finite and infinite, temporal and eternal. This healing requires what Kierkegaard called the leap of faith, the willingness to ground one's existence in something beyond human control or comprehension. The process of overcoming despair involves several crucial stages. First, one must become conscious of being in despair, recognizing that apparent satisfaction with life may mask deeper spiritual emptiness. Second, one must acknowledge that the solution cannot be found through human effort alone, but requires relationship with the transcendent. Finally, one must make the leap of faith that grounds authentic existence in divine grace rather than personal achievement or social recognition. This analysis reveals why Kierkegaard considered his psychological insights inseparable from his religious commitments. The deepest human problems cannot be solved through therapy, education, or social reform alone, though these may provide temporary relief. Ultimate healing requires confronting the spiritual dimension of human existence and accepting the conditions under which authentic selfhood becomes possible. Only through proper relationship with the eternal can human beings achieve the synthesis of finite and infinite that constitutes genuine selfhood and freedom from despair. Part 8. Irony and Indirect Communication. The Art of Spiritual Awakening. Kierkegaard developed one of the most sophisticated and influential theories of communication in philosophical history, recognizing that the most important truths cannot be communicated directly like scientific facts or mathematical theorems. His use of irony and indirect communication reflects his deep understanding that spiritual and existential truths must be discovered by each individual through their own experience and commitment. This approach revolutionized not only how we think about teaching and learning, but also how we understand the relationship between knowledge and existence. Understanding Kierkegaard's communication strategy reveals why he wrote under multiple pseudonyms and why his works often seem paradoxical or contradictory. The problem that led Kierkegaard to develop indirect communication stems from the nature of existential truth itself. Ethical and religious truth cannot be directly or immediately communicated to others because understanding such truths requires what Kierkegaard called double reflection. It is possible to have a purely verbal or conceptual understanding of spiritual truths that is nonetheless a complete misunderstanding. To successfully grasp such communications, the recipient must not only understand the words being used, but must think through what it would mean to embody or reduplicate those ideals in their own existence. This creates a fundamental challenge for anyone seeking to communicate about matters of ultimate importance. If the communicator simply states their conclusions directly, readers may accept these ideas intellectually without ever engaging with them personally or allowing them to transform their lives. The result is that the most profound truths become trivialized into abstract concepts or conventional wisdom. Direct communication of spiritual truth actually prevents authentic understanding by allowing people to think they know something when they have only grasped its external form. Kierkegaard's solution was to develop what he called the art of indirect communication. Rather than presenting conclusions to be accepted, indirect communication creates situations that provoke readers into their own reflection and decision-making. The communicator must artistically attempt to communicate in a manner that will discourage purely verbal understanding and encourage personal appropriation. This requires techniques that force readers to become actively involved in discovering truth rather than passively receiving information. Irony serves as Kierkegaard's primary tool for indirect communication. Irony operates by saying one thing while meaning something else, creating a gap between surface meaning and deeper significance that the reader must discover and interpret. Through ironic presentation, Kierkegaard could reveal the limitations and contradictions in common ways of thinking without directly attacking them. This approach respects the reader's freedom to discover truth independently while providing guidance for those willing to engage seriously with the material. Kierkegaard's use of pseudonymous authorship represents perhaps the most sophisticated application of indirect communication in literary history. Much of his work was published under various fictional names, each representing a different perspective or stage of existence. This approach allowed him to explore various viewpoints in depth without claiming that any single perspective contained the complete truth. Readers must engage actively with the text, deciding for themselves which ideas ring true and which to reject, rather than simply accepting the author's authority. Each pseudonym represents a different existential position with its own internal logic and limitations. The aesthetic author explores the possibilities and problems of living for immediate pleasure and experience. The ethical author advocates for moral duty and social responsibility. The religious authors examine different aspects of faith and spiritual commitment. By presenting these positions through fictional characters rather than in his own voice, Kierkegaard forces readers to evaluate the ideas on their own merits rather than accepting them based on external authority. This pseudonymous method also reflects Kierkegaard's recognition that existential truth cannot be separated from the person expressing it. Each pseudonym embodies a particular way of existing in the world, demonstrating through their character and actions what it means to live according to their stated principles. This integration of form and content allows readers to see not only what each position claims, but also what it looks like when lived out consistently. The contradictions and limitations of each perspective emerge naturally through the dramatic presentation rather than through abstract criticism. Kierkegaard's approach to irony was deeply influenced by his study of Socrates, whom he considered the master of ironic communication. Like Socrates, Kierkegaard used ironic questioning and dramatic presentation to expose the limitations of conventional thinking and to provoke genuine reflection. The Socratic method works not by providing answers, but by creating confusion and uncertainty that forces people to examine their own assumptions. Similarly, Kierkegaard's irony creates productive confusion that awakens readers from complacent acceptance of conventional wisdom. The goal of indirect communication is not to confuse or mislead, but to create the conditions under which authentic discovery becomes possible. Direct communication treats the reader as a passive recipient of information, while indirect communication treats the reader as an active participant in the discovery of truth. This approach acknowledges that the most important insights about existence cannot be transmitted like data, but must be personally appropriated through individual struggle and commitment. The communicator serves not as an authority figure dispensing truth, but as a midwife helping others give birth to their own understanding. Kierkegaard distinguished between different types of communication appropriate to different types of truth. For objective knowledge about factual matters, direct communication is not only appropriate but necessary. For subjective truth about existence, meaning and faith, indirect communication becomes essential because these truths involve the whole person, rather than just the intellect. The form of communication must match the nature of what is being communicated, which explains why religious and existential writing requires artistic and dramatic techniques rather than purely logical argument. The use of indirect communication also reflects Kierkegaard's respect for human freedom and individual responsibility. He believed that authentic faith and genuine existence cannot be imposed from outside, but must be freely chosen by each individual. Direct communication of religious truth would actually violate this freedom by providing certainty where uncertainty is necessary for authentic choice. Indirect communication preserves the space for doubt and decision that makes genuine faith possible. This approach has profound implications for education, therapy, and spiritual guidance. Rather than simply providing answers to people's questions, effective teaching often involves helping people discover their own answers through guided reflection and experience. The best teachers, like the best authors, create situations that provoke insight rather than merely transmitting information. This requires artistic sensitivity to know when to speak directly and when to remain silent, when to answer questions and when to ask better questions. Kierkegaard's mastery of indirect communication explains why his works continue to provoke such intense and varied responses. Rather than presenting a systematic philosophy that can be simply accepted or rejected, his writings create ongoing opportunities for reflection and discovery. Each reader must wrestle with the questions and possibilities he presents, making their own choices about how to interpret and apply his insights. This ensures that his ideas remain alive and challenging rather than becoming fossilized into academic doctrine or conventional wisdom. Part 9. Time, Eternity, and the Moment, the Intersection of Finite and Infinite. Kierkegaard developed a profound and influential understanding of time that reveals the intersection between human existence and eternal reality. His analysis moves far beyond ordinary clock time to explore what he called existential time, which involves the individual's relationship to eternity through decisive moments of choice and commitment. This temporal philosophy illuminates how finite human beings can participate in infinite meaning and how the present moment becomes the crucial arena for authentic existence. Understanding Kierkegaard's concepts of time, eternity, and the moment provides essential insight into his entire philosophical and religious vision. Kierkegaard distinguished between different types of time that correspond to different modes of human existence. Chronological time moves in a linear sequence from past through present to future, marking the rhythm of biological life and historical events. This temporal framework dominates aesthetic existence, where individuals seek immediate pleasure and avoid boredom through constant novelty. For the aesthetic person, time becomes a burden to be filled with interesting experiences, but it lacks deeper significance or direction. Ethical time operates according to the rhythm of duty and commitment, creating continuity through moral principles and social obligations. The ethical person experiences time as the arena for fulfilling responsibilities and building lasting relationships and institutions. This gives time a more substantial character than in aesthetic existence, but it remains essentially human and finite in scope. Ethical time provides stability and meaning, but does not transcend the limitations of purely temporal existence. Religious time involves what Kierkegaard called the intersection of time and eternity in the moment. This represents the highest and most authentic form of temporal experience, where finite human existence touches infinite reality. In religious time, the individual experiences their eternal significance within temporal existence, discovering that their choices and commitments have consequences that transcend ordinary historical causation. This transforms time from mere duration into the arena for decisions of ultimate importance. The concept of the moment occupies a central place in Kierkegaard's understanding of authentic existence. The moment represents the intersection between time and eternity, where the individual confronts the possibility of authentic choice and commitment. Unlike the aesthetic person who lives entirely in the immediate present, or the ethical person who is bound by past commitments and future obligations, the religious person experiences the moment as pregnant with eternal significance. In authentic moments, temporal existence becomes transparent to eternal meaning. This understanding of the moment as the intersection of time and eternity reflects Kierkegaard's analysis of the incarnation as the ultimate paradox of Christianity. The claim that the eternal God became incarnate in time at a specific historical moment represents what Kierkegaard called the absolute paradox. This event allegedly demonstrates that eternity can enter time without destroying temporality, and that finite existence can become the bearer of infinite significance. For Kierkegaard, this paradox provides the model for understanding how individual human moments can participate in eternal reality. The concept of repetition plays a crucial role in Kierkegaard's temporal philosophy. Unlike mere recollection, which looks backward to past experiences, repetition involves moving forward while maintaining continuity with what is essential from the past. This movement allows the individual to remain faithful to their deepest commitments while continuing to grow and develop. Repetition enables authentic existence by preventing both stagnation and rootless change, creating what Kierkegaard called the eternal in time. Repetition differs fundamentally from both aesthetic, novelty-seeking, and ethical routine. The aesthetic person seeks constant change and new experiences, but this actually becomes repetitive because nothing has lasting significance. The ethical person maintains consistency through adherence to universal principles, but this can become mechanical and lose vital connection to personal meaning. Religious repetition involves the ongoing renewal of fundamental commitments that deepen rather than diminish with time. Kierkegaard illustrated this concept through his analysis of Job, who represents the knight of faith who receives everything back again through repetition. Job loses everything he values, but maintains his fundamental relationship with God, ultimately receiving restoration not as external compensation, but as the fruit of deepened faith. This restoration demonstrates that authentic repetition involves getting back what was essential in a transformed and enriched form. The person of faith experiences repetition as the constant renewal of their relationship with the eternal within temporal existence. The present moment becomes crucial in Kierkegaard's analysis because it represents the only time when authentic choice and commitment are possible. The past is fixed and cannot be changed, while the future remains uncertain and unknown. Only in the present can the individual take responsibility for their existence and make the decisions that determine their eternal destiny. This emphasis on the moment reflects Kierkegaard's focus on individual decision and personal commitment, rather than abstract speculation or passive reception of truth. However, not every present moment qualifies as an authentic moment in Kierkegaard's sense. Most of our present experiences remain trapped within finite concerns and immediate impulses, lacking the depth that comes from encounter with the eternal. An authentic moment occurs when the individual recognizes the ultimate significance of their choice and commits themselves completely to what they understand to be true and valuable. Such moments transform not only the present decision, but also the meaning of past experiences and future possibilities. Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety reveals how the experience of temporal existence creates the conditions for authentic moments. Anxiety emerges from our awareness of freedom and possibility, our recognition that we must choose our future without guarantee of the consequences. This temporal uncertainty creates the space within which genuine choice becomes possible. If the future were predetermined, or if we possessed complete knowledge of outcomes, authentic decision would be impossible because there would be no real alternatives to consider. The relationship between time and eternity also illuminates Kierkegaard's understanding of historical existence. Unlike philosophers who seek to understand history as the progressive unfolding of rational principles, Kierkegaard emphasized the discontinuity and unpredictability of historical development. Each individual moment contains possibilities that cannot be deduced from past events or general laws. History becomes the arena for genuine novelty and creative action rather than the mechanical working out of predetermined patterns. This temporal philosophy has profound implications for how we understand personal identity and life planning. Rather than seeing themselves as fixed entities with predetermined destinies, individuals must recognize their responsibility for creating themselves through their choices in time. This creates both tremendous opportunity and equally tremendous responsibility. Every significant choice participates in the intersection of time and eternity, contributing to the ongoing creation of both personal identity and ultimate meaning. The concept of the eternal in time also explains Kierkegaard's critique of both worldly ambition and otherworldly escapism. Those who live only for temporal success miss the eternal dimension that gives ultimate meaning to finite achievements. Those who seek to escape from temporal existence into pure eternity miss the essential role of time as the arena where eternal significance is realized. Authentic existence requires embracing both temporal engagement and eternal perspective, finding the infinite within the finite rather than seeking to transcend finitude altogether. Part 10. Sin and Guilt, the Religious Categories of Human Existence. Kierkegaard's analysis of sin represents one of his most sophisticated contributions to understanding the human condition, moving far beyond conventional moral categories to explore sin as a fundamental spiritual reality. His treatment of sin, in works like The Concept of Anxiety and The Sickness unto Death, reveals sin not merely as moral wrongdoing, but as a deeper misrelation of the self to itself and to God. Understanding Kierkegaard's concept of sin provides crucial insight into why he considered religious categories essential for comprehending human existence, and why purely ethical or psychological approaches remain insufficient. This analysis reveals sin as both universal to human experience and yet requiring individual responsibility and choice. Kierkegaard's approach to sin begins with a fundamental distinction between sin as a psychological condition and sin as a religious category. While psychology can describe the symptoms and manifestations of spiritual distress, it cannot penetrate to the ultimate source and meaning of human alienation. Sin presupposes itself, just as freedom presupposes itself, and sin cannot be explained by anything antecedent to it, any more than can freedom. This means that sin emerges from the very structure of human existence as beings capable of choice and self-consciousness, rather than from external circumstances or biological inheritance. The concept of hereditary sin occupies a central place in Kierkegaard's analysis, but not in the traditional sense understood by most Christian theology. Rather than viewing original sin as a condition inherited from Adam that makes all subsequent humans guilty of his transgression, Kierkegaard reinterprets hereditary sin as the universal human condition of being born into a world where sin already exists. Each individual must make their own qualitative leap into sin through their own free choice, but they do so within a context where sinfulness has already become part of human experience. This preserves both individual responsibility and the recognition that sin affects the entire human condition. Kierkegaard's analysis begins with the state of innocence that characterizes human existence before the emergence of self-consciousness and moral awareness. Innocence is ignorance, a state where the individual exists as potential selfhood without awareness of good and evil or the burden of moral choice. This innocence is characterized by anxiety, which provides the possibility of freedom, and the qualitative leap from innocence into guilt. Anxiety is not itself sin, but is the natural reaction of the soul when faced with the yawning abyss of freedom that comes with moral consciousness. The transition from innocence to sin occurs when the spirit wants to posit the synthesis and freedom looks down into its possibility. Instead of finding its ground in God who has established the self, the human being seeks its foundation somewhere in the finitude of creation. This represents a fundamental misorientation of human existence, where the person attempts to establish their identity and security through finite goods rather than accepting their dependence on infinite reality. Sin thus emerges not from external temptation, but from the internal structure of human freedom, confronted with unlimited possibility. Kierkegaard distinguishes between sin as a state and individual sins as particular acts. The first sin of each individual is analogous to Adam's first sin, representing the moment when innocence is lost through the exercise of freedom in opposition to divine intention. However, once this fundamental orientation towards sin is established, it creates what Kierkegaard called the anxiety of sin, which makes subsequent sins more likely and more severe. The most terrible punishment for sin is the new sin, as each act of disobedience makes authentic choice more difficult and spiritual awareness more clouded. The psychological effects of sin create a vicious cycle that Kierkegaard analyzed with remarkable insight. Sin brings about a loss of freedom, as the person becomes increasingly trapped in patterns of self-deception and spiritual blindness. The anxiety of freedom becomes translated into anxiety over sin, and this anxiety increases as the sinful individual contemplates their entrapment in sinfulness. The cycle of sin becomes a sort of hell for the individual sinner, creating what appears to be an inescapable spiral of guilt, self-condemnation, and further moral failure. Guilt plays a crucial role in Kierkegaard's understanding of sin, but not as mere psychological remorse or social shame. Religious guilt represents the individual's awareness of their fundamental misrelation to God and to their own authentic existence. This guilt cannot be resolved through human effort, social reform, or psychological therapy, though these may provide temporary relief. Instead, religious guilt points towards the need for divine forgiveness and grace that can restore the proper relationship between the individual and God. Kierkegaard's analysis reveals the inadequacy of purely ethical approaches to human problems. While ethical reflection can help people understand moral obligations and develop better behavior patterns, it cannot address the deeper spiritual issues that manifest as sin. A person may become ethically exemplary while remaining in fundamental spiritual alienation from God and from their own authentic selfhood. This is why Kierkegaard considered the religious stage higher than the ethical stage, as it addresses the ultimate source of human spiritual distress rather than merely its symptoms. The relationship between sin and freedom is particularly complex in Kierkegaard's analysis. Sin both presupposes freedom and destroys freedom, creating what appears to be a paradox. Human beings are free to choose sin, but once they have chosen it, sin limits their capacity for authentic choice and spiritual development. This is why sin cannot be overcome through human will or effort alone, but requires what Kierkegaard called the leap of faith that opens the person to divine grace and forgiveness. Kierkegaard also explored the concept of sin as it relates to consciousness and self-awareness. The more conscious a person becomes of their sin, the more serious their condition becomes from a spiritual perspective. Unconscious sin represents spiritual deadness, but conscious sin that persists despite awareness represents active rebellion against God and authentic existence. The highest form of sin is the deliberate choice to remain in sin despite knowing better, which Kierkegaard saw as a form of spiritual suicide. The universality of sin in Kierkegaard's analysis does not lead to moral relativism or the excuse that everyone is equally guilty. While sin affects all human existence, individuals remain responsible for their particular responses to their sinful condition. Some people develop greater awareness of their spiritual condition and make more authentic efforts toward repentance and faith. Others retreat into unconscious conformity or conscious rebellion, deepening their alienation from God and authentic selfhood. Kierkegaard's understanding of sin ultimately points toward the necessity of divine grace and the possibility of redemption. While sin represents a fundamental spiritual crisis that cannot be resolved through human effort alone, it also creates the conditions under which authentic faith becomes possible. The person who becomes aware of their sinful condition may be motivated to seek the kind of relationship with God that can restore spiritual health and authentic existence. In this sense, sin serves not only as humanity's greatest problem, but also as the precondition for humanity's highest spiritual development through faith and divine grace. Part 11. Repetition versus recollection, forward movement versus backward looking. In his work Repetition, Kierkegaard introduced one of his most important but often misunderstood concepts that reveals how authentic existence requires a fundamentally different relationship to time and memory than most people achieve. Through the character Constantine Constantius, Kierkegaard explores whether genuine repetition is possible and what it means for human development and spiritual growth. This concept provides crucial insight into how individuals can maintain continuity and meaning while continuing to grow and develop, avoiding both the trap of aesthetic novelty-seeking and the stagnation of mere ethical routine. Understanding repetition versus recollection reveals Kierkegaard's profound insights about temporality, identity, and the conditions for authentic selfhood. Repetition must be clearly distinguished from both simple recurrence and nostalgic recollection to understand its deeper significance. Recollection involves looking backward to past experiences with longing or regret, attempting to recapture what has been lost, or to find meaning by dwelling on previous moments. Repetition and recollection are the same movement, just in opposite directions, for what is recollected is repeated backward. While recollection confines itself to motionlessness and to the past, Kierkegaard's concept of repetition is in constant movement and is connected to the ethical future. The aesthetic individual typically lives through a constant cycle of seeking novelty and then falling into boredom when experiences lose their freshness. This creates a restless pursuit of new stimulations that paradoxically becomes repetitive in its very novelty-seeking. The aesthetic person cannot find lasting satisfaction because they refuse to commit deeply to anything, always moving on to the next interesting experience. This approach to life ultimately becomes self-defeating because it prevents the kind of sustained engagement that creates genuine meaning and development. Recollection represents a different but equally problematic approach to temporal existence. The person who lives primarily through recollection becomes trapped in the past, constantly comparing present experiences to idealized memories. Recollection's love, an author has said, is the only happy love. He is perfectly right in that, of course, provided one recollects that initially it makes a person unhappy. While recollection may provide temporary comfort, it ultimately prevents authentic engagement with present reality and future possibility. Genuine repetition involves what Constantine Constantius calls taking again or recollecting forward. The Danish term gentagelse literally means to take again, suggesting an active process of appropriating something valuable from the past while moving toward the future. Repetition is a movement forward, but it is not one of flight from the past or mere pursuit of novelty. Instead, repetition involves the ongoing renewal of fundamental commitments and relationships that deepen rather than diminish with time. Repetition's love is in truth the only happy love because it combines the security of genuine commitment with the vitality of ongoing growth and development. Like Recollection's love, it does not have the restlessness of hope or the uneasy adventurousness of discovery, but neither does it have the sadness of recollection. Repetition provides what Kierkegaard called the blissful security of the moment, where past commitment and future possibility unite in present experience. This represents a fundamentally different way of experiencing time that transcends the opposition between past-oriented nostalgia and future-oriented anxiety. The concept of repetition is closely connected to Kierkegaard's understanding of marriage and committed relationships. In the aesthetic stage, relationships are based on immediate attraction and novelty, leading to constant change and eventual boredom. In the ethical stage, relationships may be maintained through duty and social obligation, but they can become routine and lose their vital character. True repetition in relationship involves the ongoing choice to love and commit to the same person, while allowing that relationship to deepen and develop over time. Constantine Constantius attempts an experiment to test whether repetition is possible by returning to Berlin, where he had previously enjoyed himself. He hopes to recreate the same experiences and find the same satisfaction in familiar places and activities. However, the experiment fails because he approaches repetition as mere recurrence rather than authentic renewal. The external circumstances have changed. His landlord has married, the theatre is different, and Constantine himself has changed in ways that make simple recurrence impossible. This failed experiment reveals that repetition cannot be achieved through external manipulation or by trying to recreate past circumstances. True repetition requires an inner transformation that allows the person to encounter familiar experiences with renewed appreciation and deeper understanding. It is not about returning to the same place physically, but about achieving a spiritual condition where the eternal meaning of experiences can be recognized and appropriated. This requires what Kierkegaard called courage to will repetition, rather than settling for the safety of recollection or the excitement of aesthetic novelty. The relationship between repetition and religious faith becomes particularly important in Kierkegaard's analysis. The highest form of repetition occurs when the individual receives back from God what has been offered in sacrifice, as illustrated through the biblical story of Job. Job loses everything he values, but maintains his fundamental relationship with God, ultimately receiving restoration not as external compensation, but as the fruit of deepened faith. This religious repetition demonstrates that authentic renewal involves getting back what was essential in a transformed and enriched form. Kierkegaard contrasts the young man in repetition, who cannot achieve authentic repetition in his romantic relationship, with the model of religious repetition found in figures like Job and Abraham. The young man becomes trapped between aesthetic recollection of his beloved and ethical obligation to marry her, unable to achieve the kind of religious commitment that would make genuine repetition possible. His failure illustrates how repetition requires moving beyond both aesthetic immediacy and ethical duty to the religious stage where authentic renewal becomes possible. Only through relationship with the eternal can temporal experiences achieve the kind of meaning that makes repetition worthwhile. The concept of repetition also illuminates Kierkegaard's understanding of personal identity and self-development. Rather than seeing the self as a fixed entity that remains static over time or as a constantly changing flux without continuity, repetition suggests a dynamic process of ongoing self-creation. The authentic individual maintains continuity with their essential commitments and values while remaining open to growth and transformation. This requires the kind of spiritual maturity that can distinguish between what should be preserved and what should be changed as one moves through life. Repetition thus represents a middle way between the extremes of rigid conservatism and rootless change. It allows for genuine development and growth while maintaining the kind of commitment and consistency that creates meaning and identity. The person who achieves authentic repetition can embrace new experiences and insights while remaining faithful to their deepest convictions and relationships. This creates the possibility of a life that is both stable and dynamic, grounded and growing, committed and creative. The importance of repetition extends beyond individual psychology to questions of culture, tradition, and social development. Societies that can achieve authentic repetition are able to preserve what is valuable from their heritage while adapting to new circumstances and challenges. Those that become trapped in either nostalgic recollection or restless innovation lose the capacity for genuine renewal and development. Kierkegaard's insights about repetition thus provide resources for thinking about how communities and institutions can maintain continuity while remaining vital and responsive to changing needs. Part 12. The Teleological Suspension of the Ethical when God Transcends Morality. One of Kierkegaard's most challenging and controversial concepts appears in Fear and Trembling through his analysis of what he calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. This concept emerges from his examination of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac in response to God's command, raising profound questions about the relationship between religious faith and moral obligation. Understanding this concept requires grappling with Kierkegaard's claim that authentic religious commitment may sometimes require going beyond or even against universal moral principles when they conflict with divine authority. This insight reveals both the ultimate priority of religious over ethical commitment and the enormous difficulty and responsibility that such faith entails. To understand the teleological suspension of the ethical, we must first grasp what Kierkegaard means by the ethical as universal moral obligation. The ethical represents that which is incumbent upon all people at all times, the universal moral principles that provide the foundation for social life and human cooperation. Sin occurs when an individual asserts himself as an individual over and against the universal, placing personal desire or interest above moral duty. From this perspective, the highest human achievement is to become part of the universal by fulfilling one's ethical obligations and contributing to the moral order that benefits all people. According to this understanding, the ethical represents the highest telos or end goal that humans can achieve. There is no higher purpose beyond ethical duty, and the individual's ultimate goal should be to transcend their particularity by serving universal moral principles. If this view is correct, then Hegel and other philosophers are right to see individual existence as potentially problematic and to emphasize the importance of social integration and moral conformity. From this perspective, any action that violates universal ethical principles must be condemned as immoral, regardless of the individual's personal motivations or claimed religious justifications. However, Abraham's situation presents a fundamental challenge to this ethical framework. When God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham faces a choice that cannot be resolved through normal ethical reasoning. From any conventional moral perspective, killing one's child represents the most fundamental violation of parental duty and human decency. Yet Abraham believes that God's command creates a higher obligation that transcends ordinary ethical categories. Kierkegaard contrasts Abraham's situation with that of tragic heroes like Agamemnon, who sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to secure favourable winds for the Greek fleet. The tragic hero still remains within the ethical framework because he can justify his terrible choice through reference to a higher ethical good. Agamemnon sacrifices his personal desires and parental love for the sake of his duty as king and his obligation to the Greek people. While his choice is painful and tragic, it makes sense within an ethical framework that recognizes competing moral claims and the necessity of choosing the greater good. Abraham's situation is fundamentally different and more challenging than that of the tragic hero. By his act he overstepped the ethical entirely and possessed a higher telos outside of it, in relation to which he suspended the former. Abraham cannot appeal to any universal moral principle or social good to justify his intended action. If anything, sacrificing Isaac would destroy the very promise through which God had pledged to make Abraham the father of many nations. This creates what Kierkegaard calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. Teleological refers to the end or purpose toward which an action is directed, and suspension means temporarily setting aside or transcending. Abraham suspends his ethical obligation to Isaac because he recognizes a higher telos that comes from his relationship with God rather than from universal moral principles. This does not mean that Abraham rejects ethics entirely or considers moral obligations unimportant, but rather that he recognizes divine authority as ultimately higher than human moral systems. The teleological suspension of the ethical does not make Abraham's action less serious or difficult. Abraham knows that killing Isaac is ethically wrong according to universal moral standards, and he bears full responsibility for his choice. He cannot explain his action to others or justify it through rational argument, because it transcends the realm of ordinary human discourse. Abraham acts in complete isolation, unable to communicate his deepest motivations even to his wife Sarah or his son Isaac. This isolation is essential to the nature of the teleological suspension of the ethical. If Abraham could justify his action through universal principles that others could understand and accept, he would not have transcended the ethical, but would simply have appealed to a higher ethical standard. The fact that his action appears completely unjustifiable from any rational ethical perspective is precisely what makes it a genuine suspension of ethics in favor of religious commitment. Abraham must act purely on faith, without the security of moral reasoning or social approval. Kierkegaard is careful to distinguish between authentic religious suspension of ethics and mere personal willfulness or fanaticism. The teleological suspension of the ethical is not a license for individuals to violate moral obligations whenever they claim divine inspiration. Abraham's situation is unique because of his special relationship with God and the specific nature of God's command and promise. Most people who claim divine authority for unethical actions are either self-deceived or deliberately manipulative. The concept of the teleological suspension of the ethical also reveals the ultimate inadequacy of purely rational approaches to religious faith. If religious truth could be demonstrated through logical argument, or if religious obligations could be reduced to ethical principles, then faith would become unnecessary. The fact that genuine religious commitment sometimes requires going beyond rational ethics is precisely what makes faith both necessary and difficult. This does not mean that faith is irrational, but rather that it transcends the limitations of purely human reasoning. The teleological suspension of the ethical has profound implications for understanding religious authority and the relationship between individual conscience and social moral systems. While most religious and moral education emphasizes the importance of following established rules and social expectations, Kierkegaard suggests that authentic faith may sometimes require individuals to act against conventional wisdom. This creates enormous responsibility for the individual, who must discern between authentic divine calling and mere personal preference or social pressure. The possibility of religious transcendence of ethics makes religious life both more significant and more dangerous than purely ethical existence. However, Kierkegaard also emphasizes that the teleological suspension of the ethical represents the exception rather than the rule. Most religious life involves the integration and fulfillment of ethical obligations rather than their suspension. The religious person typically finds that their faith strengthens rather than weakens their commitment to moral responsibility and social justice. The teleological suspension occurs only in extraordinary circumstances where divine authority clearly conflicts with human moral systems, and it requires the kind of spiritual maturity and authentic relationship with God that few people achieve. Part 13. Christianity versus Christendom. The critique of institutional religion. Kierkegaard's most passionate and sustained critique focused on what he saw as the fundamental difference between authentic Christianity and what he called Christendom, the institutional, social and cultural form that Christianity had taken in his Danish society. This distinction became increasingly central to his work, culminating in his fierce attack on the Danish state church during the final years of his life. Understanding this critique reveals Kierkegaard's deep concern that organized religion had betrayed the radical nature of Christian faith by making it comfortable, respectable, and socially acceptable. His analysis remains remarkably relevant for understanding the ongoing tension between authentic spiritual commitment and institutional religious practice. Christendom represents the domestication and socialization of Christianity, transforming it from a demanding spiritual commitment into a comfortable cultural identity. In Christendom, being Christian becomes a matter of social respectability rather than personal transformation. People attend church, follow social conventions, and identify themselves as Christians without ever experiencing the kind of radical encounter with God that authentic Christianity requires. This creates a false sense of security, where individuals assume they are Christians simply because they participate in Christian society and follow Christian customs. Kierkegaard argued that Christendom had lost its way by recognizing the crowd as the court of last resort in relation to truth. Truth comes to a single individual, not to all people at one and the same time. Just as truth comes to one individual at a time, so does love. One does not love the crowd, but does love their neighbor, who is a single individual. Never have I read in the Holy Scriptures this command, "You shall love the crowd," even less. You shall, ethico-religiously, recognize in the crowd the court of last resort in relation to the truth. The transformation of Christianity into Christendom involves several fundamental distortions that Kierkegaard identified with devastating precision. First, objective knowledge about Christian doctrine becomes more important than subjective appropriation and personal transformation. People study theology, memorize biblical passages, and understand Christian concepts intellectually without ever allowing these truths to change their lives. This creates what Kierkegaard called the illusion of faith, where people mistake intellectual knowledge for spiritual commitment. Second, Christianity becomes a matter of social conformity rather than individual decision and risk. In Christendom, being Christian means following the expectations of Christian society rather than making the difficult personal choice to follow Christ. This eliminates the anxiety, uncertainty, and personal responsibility that Kierkegaard saw as essential to authentic faith. When Christianity becomes the socially expected and respectable choice, it loses its character as a leap of faith that requires courage and personal commitment. Third, the radical demands of Christianity are softened and compromised to make them compatible with ordinary social and economic life. The challenging teachings about self-sacrifice, love of enemies, and abandonment of worldly security are reinterpreted or ignored to avoid conflict with social expectations and personal comfort. This creates what Kierkegaard called playing Christianity, where people go through the motions of Christian practice without accepting its transformative demands. The result is a domesticated religion that reinforces rather than challenges existing social arrangements and personal priorities. Kierkegaard's critique of the clergy was particularly sharp, as he saw religious professionals as the primary agents of Christianity's transformation into Christendom. He viewed pastors as mere political officials, representatives of social respectability, rather than authentic spiritual authority. The clergy had become too comfortable, too respectable, and too integrated into existing social structures to represent the radical challenge that Christianity should pose to conventional life. Instead of calling people to authentic faith, they provided religious comfort that allowed people to feel spiritual without changing their fundamental orientation toward existence. The institutional church, in Kierkegaard's analysis, had become a barrier to rather than a vehicle for authentic Christian commitment. By making Christianity into a system of beliefs to be accepted rather than a way of life to be lived, the Church had eliminated the personal struggle and transformation that defines genuine faith. People could join the Church, participate in its rituals, and identify with its teachings without ever experiencing the kind of encounter with God that transforms individual existence. This institutional mediation of faith actually prevented the direct, personal relationship with God that Christianity should foster. Kierkegaard's understanding of authentic Christianity emphasizes the radical nature of following Christ as an individual choice that cannot be mediated through social institutions or cultural traditions. True Christianity requires what he called imitation of Christ, not merely admiration or intellectual appreciation. This imitation involves accepting the same risks, sacrifices and social opposition that Jesus faced rather than enjoying the social benefits of Christian identity. Authentic Christians must be willing to stand alone, to face misunderstanding and persecution, and to prioritize their relationship with God above social acceptance and worldly success. The concept of becoming a Christian versus being born a Christian is central to Kierkegaard's critique of Christendom. In Christendom, people assume they are Christians because they are born into Christian societies and raised with Christian customs and beliefs. But Kierkegaard argued that becoming a Christian requires a personal decision and transformation that cannot be inherited or assumed. Each individual must choose for themselves whether to accept the demands and risks of authentic Christian faith, regardless of their cultural background or social expectations. Kierkegaard's attack on the Danish state church during the final year of his life represented the culmination of his critique of Christendom. He refused communion and declared that the pastors were not true representatives of Christianity, but merely civil servants promoting social conformity. His periodical The Moment launched a sustained assault on what he saw as the betrayal of Christianity by its institutional representatives. This attack cost him his health and ultimately his life, but it represented his final attempt to awaken people to the difference between authentic Christianity and comfortable Christendom. The relevance of Kierkegaard's critique extends far beyond his specific historical context to address ongoing issues in contemporary religious life. The tendency to domesticate radical religious demands, to emphasize intellectual understanding over personal transformation, and to make faith into a matter of cultural identity rather than individual commitment, remains a persistent challenge. Religious institutions continue to face the tension between providing social stability and comfort and calling people to authentic spiritual transformation. Kierkegaard's analysis provides valuable resources for recognizing and addressing these tensions in contemporary religious practice. However, Kierkegaard's critique should not be interpreted as a complete rejection of religious community or institutional support for faith. Rather, his concern was that institutional religion should serve authentic faith rather than replacing it with comfortable conformity. Religious communities can provide valuable support, teaching, and encouragement for individual spiritual development when they maintain focus on personal transformation rather than social respectability. The key is ensuring that institutional religion remains a means to authentic faith rather than becoming a substitute for the personal encounter with God that defines genuine Christianity. Part 14. The Demonic, the Spiritual State of Enclosed Reserve. Among Kierkegaard's most penetrating psychological insights is his analysis of what he calls the demonic, a spiritual condition that represents a perverted form of spirituality characterized by what he termed shut-upness or enclosed reserve. This concept appears throughout his work but receives its most systematic treatment in the concept of anxiety, where it illuminates a particular form of spiritual sickness that affects those who have achieved some level of self-consciousness but have turned away from authentic development. Understanding the demonic reveals how spiritual awareness can become corrupted and self-destructive rather than leading to growth and freedom. This analysis provides crucial insight into certain forms of psychological and spiritual distress that cannot be understood through purely clinical or ethical categories. The demonic represents what Kierkegaard calls unfreedom, but not the simple absence of freedom that characterizes innocence or ignorance. Rather, the demonic involves a perverse relationship to freedom, where the individual recognizes their capacity for authentic choice but deliberately chooses to limit or corrupt that capacity. This creates a spiritual condition that is neither innocent nor authentically free, but rather represents freedom turned against itself. The demonic individual has enough spiritual development to recognize authentic possibilities, but lacks the courage or will to pursue them, instead choosing forms of existence that provide the illusion of spirituality while avoiding its genuine demands. Shut-upness, or enclosed reserve, serves as the primary characteristic of the demonic condition. This involves the individual's inability or unwillingness to communicate their deepest thoughts, feelings, and spiritual condition to others. Unlike healthy privacy or appropriate boundaries, demonic reserve represents a fundamental isolation that prevents authentic relationship both with other people and with God. The demonic individual becomes trapped within their own consciousness, unable to break out of self-imposed spiritual imprisonment. This enclosed reserve manifests in several different forms that Kierkegaard analyzed with remarkable psychological sophistication. Some demonic individuals become completely mute, unable to express their inner condition through any form of communication. Others become compulsively talkative, using constant chatter to avoid genuine communication about what matters most to them. Still others develop sophisticated forms of indirect expression that reveal and conceal simultaneously, creating the appearance of openness while maintaining fundamental hiddenness. The demonic condition often develops in individuals who have experienced significant spiritual or psychological trauma that they cannot integrate into a coherent understanding of themselves and their world. Rather than seeking help or working through their difficulties, they retreat into a self-protective isolation that gradually becomes self-destructive. This shut-upness provides temporary relief from anxiety and external demands, but ultimately prevents the kind of authentic relationship with others and with God that could provide genuine healing. The demonic individual chooses the security of known suffering over the risk of unknown possibilities for growth and recovery. Kierkegaard distinguished between different levels of demonic consciousness that reveal increasing sophistication and danger. The most basic form involves unconscious demonic behavior, where the individual acts out their spiritual distress without understanding its nature or source. More dangerous is conscious demonic behavior, where the person recognizes their condition, but chooses to maintain it rather than seeking authentic change. The most serious form is what Kierkegaard called the demonic with consciousness of evil, where the individual not only recognizes their spiritual sickness but takes perverse satisfaction in it. The relationship between the demonic and creativity presents particular challenges for understanding this condition. Many highly creative and intellectually gifted individuals exhibit demonic characteristics, using their talents to create elaborate systems of thought or artistic expression that serve primarily to maintain their isolation rather than facilitating genuine communication. Such individuals may produce work of great sophistication and apparent insight, while remaining fundamentally cut off from authentic relationship with others. Their creativity becomes a form of sophisticated shut-upness rather than a means of genuine self-expression and communication. Kierkegaard's analysis of the demonic also reveals its connection to pride and the refusal to accept help from others. The demonic individual often possesses genuine insight and spiritual sensitivity, but refuses to acknowledge their need for grace, forgiveness, or assistance from other people or from God. This pride manifests as a determination to solve their own problems through self-effort, rather than accepting the vulnerability that authentic relationship requires. The result is a form of spiritual isolation that may appear noble or self-sufficient, but actually represents a refusal to accept the fundamental interdependence that characterizes healthy human existence. The demonic condition can also manifest through various forms of compulsive behavior that provide the illusion of spiritual discipline while actually serving to maintain spiritual stagnation. Some individuals develop elaborate religious practices, intellectual pursuits, or moral disciplines that occupy their attention and energy while preventing genuine spiritual growth. These activities may appear admirable from external perspective, but function primarily as sophisticated forms of avoidance, rather than authentic spiritual development. The demonic individual becomes trapped in cycles of activity that provide the feeling of spiritual progress while maintaining fundamental spiritual deadness. Kierkegaard identified certain professions and social roles as particularly susceptible to demonic corruption. Intellectuals, clergy, artists, and others whose work involves spiritual or creative expression face special temptations to use their roles as forms of sophisticated hiddenness. They may develop public personas that appear spiritually advanced, while their private spiritual life remains stunted or corrupted. The very skills that should facilitate authentic spiritual development become means of avoiding the vulnerability and risk that genuine growth requires. The treatment of demonic conditions requires what Kierkegaard called revelation, the breaking open of shut-upness through authentic communication and relationship. This typically involves some form of crisis or intervention that forces the demonic individual to confront their isolation and recognize their need for authentic relationship. The process is often painful and resisted because it requires abandoning the security of known suffering for the uncertainty of genuine change. Recovery requires not only intellectual insight, but also the courage to risk authentic vulnerability and relationship despite past trauma or disappointment. The religious dimension of healing from demonic conditions involves recognizing that ultimate security and meaning cannot be found through self-effort or human relationship alone. The demonic individual must eventually make what Kierkegaard called the leap of faith that opens them to divine grace and forgiveness. This requires abandoning the pride and self-sufficiency that characterize the demonic condition in favor of the kind of dependence on God that makes authentic spiritual freedom possible. Only through proper relationship with the eternal can the individual escape the spiritual prison of shut-upness and achieve genuine communication and community with others. Part 15. Love and Marriage, the aesthetic versus ethical approaches to relationship. Kierkegaard's exploration of love and marriage provides one of his most concrete and practical applications of his analysis of the different stages of existence. Through works like Either Or and Stages on Life's Way, he examined how aesthetic, ethical, and religious approaches to love create fundamentally different types of relationships with vastly different outcomes for human happiness and development. His insights into the nature of romantic love, erotic attraction, and committed marriage reveal how the stage of existence one occupies determines not only how one loves, but what kind of love one is capable of experiencing. Understanding these different approaches to love illuminates broader questions about commitment, authenticity, and the conditions for meaningful human relationship. The aesthetic approach to love focuses primarily on immediate attraction, novelty, and the pursuit of romantic excitement. The aesthetic lover is captivated by beauty, charm, and the intoxicating feelings that accompany new romantic experiences. This approach treats love as primarily a matter of emotion and sensation, seeking to maximize pleasure and avoid anything that might diminish the intensity of romantic feeling. The aesthetic lover fears commitment because it appears to limit possibilities for new experiences and threatens to transform exciting romantic adventure into routine domestic life. Kierkegaard's analysis of aesthetic love reveals its fundamental instability and ultimate self-defeating character. Because aesthetic love depends entirely on immediate feeling and external attraction, it inevitably fades as novelty wears off and familiarity replaces excitement. The aesthetic lover then faces a choice between accepting the decline of passionate feeling or seeking new romantic partners who can provide fresh stimulation. Either choice leads to dissatisfaction. Accepting faded passion means settling for a relationship that no longer provides aesthetic satisfaction, while pursuing new partners means never developing the deeper intimacy that comes from sustained commitment. The aesthetic approach also treats the beloved as primarily an object for one's own satisfaction, rather than as a genuine person with independent existence and value. The aesthetic lover falls in love with their own feelings and fantasies, rather than with the actual person who triggers these experiences. This creates a fundamental solitude within romantic relationship, as the lover never truly encounters the other person, but remains trapped within their own subjective experience. When the beloved inevitably reveals characteristics that conflict with the lover's fantasies, the aesthetic relationship typically ends in disappointment and mutual misunderstanding. The ethical approach to love and marriage represents a significant advance over the aesthetic approach by introducing the elements of commitment, responsibility, and genuine concern for the other person's welfare. The ethical lover recognizes that authentic love requires choosing to commit to another person, regardless of fluctuating emotions or changing circumstances. This approach views marriage as a moral obligation that creates mutual duties and responsibilities that must be fulfilled even when they conflict with immediate desires or preferences. The ethical lover seeks to develop character traits like fidelity, patience, and sacrificial concern that enable sustainable and morally responsible relationship. Judge William, one of Kierkegaard's pseudonymous characters, represents the ethical approach to marriage in its most developed form. He advocates for marriage as the supreme ethical choice, arguing that through commitment the self acquires temporal continuity and authentic relationship becomes possible. The ethical marriage transforms erotic love by placing it within a framework of mutual responsibility and shared life purpose. Rather than seeking to maintain constant romantic excitement, the ethical couple builds a relationship based on mutual respect, shared values, and commitment to each other's growth and development. The ethical approach offers several important advantages over aesthetic love that Kierkegaard clearly recognized and appreciated. Ethical marriage provides stability, security, and the opportunity for deep intimacy that can only develop through sustained commitment over time. It allows both partners to experience the satisfaction that comes from keeping promises, fulfilling responsibilities, and building something lasting together. The ethical lover can experience forms of happiness that are simply unavailable to the aesthetic lover, including the joy of self-sacrifice for another's welfare and the deep contentment that comes from mutual trust and commitment. However, Kierkegaard also identified significant limitations in the purely ethical approach to love and marriage. When marriage becomes primarily a matter of duty and social obligation, it can lose its vital character and become merely a form of respectable conformity. The ethical couple may fulfill all their mutual obligations while missing the deeper spiritual dimension that gives ultimate meaning to human relationship. They may develop a good marriage according to social standards while never experiencing the kind of transformative love that touches the eternal dimension of human existence. The religious approach to love represents the highest form of human relationship by grounding commitment in divine rather than merely human authority. Religious love involves recognizing the other person as created by and beloved of God, which transforms how one relates to them. This approach does not reject either aesthetic appreciation or ethical responsibility, but places both within the context of ultimate meaning that comes from relationship with the eternal. The religious lover can enjoy beauty and maintain commitment while recognizing that both the beloved and the relationship itself are gifts from God that require grateful stewardship rather than possessive control. Religious love also introduces the crucial element of forgiveness that makes sustainable relationship possible despite human imperfection and failure. Both aesthetic and ethical approaches to love ultimately fail when confronted with the reality of human sinfulness and limitation. Aesthetic love cannot survive the revelation that the beloved is not the idealized fantasy the lover imagined. Ethical love can maintain commitment but may become bitter and resentful when the other person fails to fulfill their obligations or live up to moral expectations. Only religious love provides the resources for genuine forgiveness and renewal when relationships face serious challenges. Because religious love recognizes both partners as sinful beings in need of divine grace, it can extend mercy when human effort fails. This creates the possibility of authentic reconciliation and ongoing growth even after serious failures or disappointments. The religious couple can experience what Kierkegaard called repetition in their relationship, receiving back their love in enriched and deepened form after it has been tested by difficulty and renewed through forgiveness. Kierkegaard's own broken engagement to Regine Olsen provides a complex personal backdrop to his theoretical analysis of love and marriage. His decision to break the engagement appears to reflect his belief that he could not achieve the kind of authentic love that marriage requires while remaining committed to his philosophical and religious calling. Whether this represents spiritual insight or personal failure remains a matter of scholarly debate, but it clearly influenced his understanding of the challenges involved in achieving authentic love. His personal struggle illuminates the difficulty of integrating romantic relationship with ultimate spiritual commitment and the tragic conflicts that can arise between different forms of human obligation. The contemporary relevance of Kierkegaard's analysis remains striking in a culture that often oscillates between aesthetic romanticism and ethical contractualism in approaching love and marriage. Many people expect marriage to provide constant romantic excitement while also fulfilling practical needs for security and social respectability. When marriages fail to meet these conflicting expectations, couples often face the same choice between aesthetic flight and ethical endurance that Kierkegaard analyzed. His insights suggest that sustainable and meaningful relationship requires the religious dimension that grounds human love in divine love and provides resources for forgiveness, renewal, and authentic spiritual development within committed relationship. Part 16. The Concept of Irony, Kierkegaard's Socratic Method. Kierkegaard's understanding and use of irony represents one of his most sophisticated philosophical techniques, deeply rooted in his study of Socrates and developed into a powerful method for spiritual and intellectual awakening. His doctoral dissertation on the concept of irony with continual reference to Socrates established irony as a central concept in his philosophical approach, providing the foundation for his later development of indirect communication. Understanding Kierkegaard's concept of irony reveals how he sought to avoid the pitfalls of direct communication about spiritual matters while creating the conditions under which authentic insight and commitment become possible. This analysis illuminates both his literary technique and his deeper philosophical purpose of awakening individuals to authentic existence. Kierkegaard distinguished between several different types of irony, each serving different philosophical and spiritual purposes. Speculative irony operates at the level of ideas and concepts, revealing contradictions and limitations in theoretical systems and abstract thinking. Existential irony addresses the contradictions and self-deceptions that characterize human existence, particularly the gap between what people claim to believe and how they actually live. Romantic irony involves the author's self-conscious manipulation of literary form and content to create particular effects in readers. Socratic irony serves as the foundational model for all of Kierkegaard's ironic techniques. Socrates perfected the art of appearing ignorant while exposing the ignorance of those who claim to possess knowledge and wisdom. Through carefully crafted questions and apparent deference to supposed experts, Socrates revealed that most people's confident assertions about important matters were based on unexamined assumptions and confused thinking. This ironic technique served not merely to humiliate or criticize, but to create the intellectual and spiritual crisis necessary for authentic learning and growth. Kierkegaard adopted and refined Socratic irony for his own philosophical purposes, recognizing its unique power to provoke genuine reflection without imposing predetermined conclusions. Rather than telling readers what to think about spiritual and existential matters, ironic presentation forces them to examine their own assumptions and make their own discoveries. This approach respects human freedom and individual responsibility while providing guidance for those willing to engage seriously with the material. Irony creates the space for authentic choice by revealing the inadequacy of conventional answers without providing easy alternatives. The ironic technique becomes particularly important when dealing with religious and existential truth that cannot be communicated directly like scientific information. If someone simply states religious conclusions, readers may accept them intellectually without ever experiencing the personal transformation that authentic spiritual insight requires. Ironic presentation prevents this superficial acceptance by creating confusion and uncertainty that forces readers to struggle with fundamental questions for themselves. This struggle is essential to authentic spiritual development because the most important truths must be personally appropriated rather than merely understood conceptually. Kierkegaard's use of pseudonymous authorship represents perhaps the most sophisticated application of ironic technique in philosophical literature. By writing under fictional names, each with their own distinct personality and perspective, Kierkegaard created an ironic distance between himself and his ideas. Readers cannot simply accept or reject Kierkegaard's authority because they must first determine which pseudonym is speaking and whether that character represents a perspective Kierkegaard endorses or criticizes. This forces active engagement with the ideas themselves rather than passive reliance on external authority. Each pseudonym embodies a particular existential position with its own internal logic and limitations, creating what might be called dramatic irony. The aesthetic authors explore the possibilities and problems of living for immediate pleasure without ever fully recognizing the spiritual emptiness of their approach. The ethical authors advocate for moral duty and social responsibility while remaining blind to the ultimate limitations of purely human moral systems. Even the religious authors often represent incomplete or problematic forms of faith that reveal the difficulty of achieving authentic spiritual commitment. This ironic presentation allows Kierkegaard to explore various perspectives sympathetically, while simultaneously revealing their limitations and contradictions. Readers must develop the ability to appreciate the insights of each position while recognizing where it falls short of complete truth. This creates a form of spiritual education that develops discrimination and judgment rather than simply providing information or exhortation. The ironic technique teaches people how to think about existential matters rather than merely what to think. Kierkegaard's irony also serves to reveal the contradictions and self-deceptions that characterize most people's approach to spiritual and moral questions. Through ironic presentation, he can expose the gap between what people claim to believe and how they actually live without directly attacking or condemning them. This approach is more likely to produce genuine self-examination than direct criticism, which typically provokes defensive reactions rather than authentic reflection. Ironic revelation allows people to discover their own inconsistencies and make their own decisions about whether and how to address them. The relationship between irony and humour is particularly important in Kierkegaard's technique. True irony often produces a kind of rueful laughter as people recognize their own contradictions and pretensions reflected in ironic presentation. This humour serves not to trivialize serious matters, but to create the emotional distance necessary for honest self-examination. When people can laugh at their own spiritual and intellectual pretensions, they become more capable of honest assessment and authentic change. However, Kierkegaard recognized that irony has its own limitations and dangers that must be carefully managed. Purely negative irony that only criticizes and destroys without pointing toward positive alternatives can become destructive and nihilistic. The ironist may become trapped in a perpetual critical stance that prevents authentic commitment and positive action. This is why Kierkegaard eventually moved beyond purely ironic presentation toward more direct forms of communication in his later religious works. The educational purpose of Kierkegaardian irony is ultimately constructive rather than destructive, seeking to clear away false certainties in order to make space for authentic insight and commitment. Like Socratic questioning, Kierkegaardian irony aims to produce what he called profitable confusion that motivates genuine learning and growth. The goal is not to leave people in permanent uncertainty, but to help them develop the spiritual and intellectual maturity necessary for authentic choice and commitment. Irony serves as a form of spiritual midwifery that helps people give birth to their own authentic insights rather than accepting predetermined conclusions. The continued relevance of Kierkegaardian irony appears in its applicability to contemporary forms of spiritual and intellectual complacency. In an age of information overload and superficial religious and philosophical discourse, ironic techniques remain valuable for provoking genuine reflection and authentic engagement. The ability to reveal contradictions and self-deceptions through indirect presentation continues to offer resources for spiritual and intellectual awakening. Understanding Kierkegaardian irony provides tools for both creating and recognizing authentic spiritual communication, in contrast to mere propaganda, manipulation, or superficial entertainment. Part 17. Genius versus Apostle and Kierkegaard's Enduring Legacy. One of Kierkegaard's most penetrating analyses appears in his distinction between genius and apostle, illuminating fundamental questions about the source and nature of spiritual authority. Genius represents the highest form of human achievement within finite categories of excellence, recognized through human appreciation and critical evaluation. The genius appeals to reason and judgment for validation, whether in art, science, or moral teaching. People follow genius because they can recognize its excellence, not because it claims external authority beyond human evaluation. The apostle operates according to completely different principles that transcend human categories of evaluation. An apostle receives authority not from personal excellence, but from divine appointment, speaking on behalf of God rather than human wisdom. The apostle cannot appeal to human standards of evaluation because divine truth transcends human categories of assessment. This creates the fundamental challenge of religious authority. It requires faith rather than rational demonstration. Yet it must communicate to beings who naturally seek evidence and reasoning. Confusion between genius and apostle has created serious problems in approaching religious authority. When religious leaders are evaluated primarily as geniuses, religion becomes human wisdom rather than divine revelation. When genuine geniuses are treated as apostles, human insights become invested with inappropriate divine authority. Understanding this distinction helps clarify why authentic religious commitment requires faith that goes beyond rational evaluation while remaining grounded in genuine spiritual discernment. The profound influence of Kierkegaard extends far beyond 19th century philosophy, shaping virtually every aspect of modern intellectual life. As the father of existentialism, his insights about anxiety, freedom, and authentic existence influenced philosophers like Sartre, Heidegger, and Marcel, even when they moved toward atheistic conclusions. His analysis of anxiety anticipated modern psychology by half a century, influencing therapeutic approaches that recognize anxiety as fundamental to human existence rather than merely pathological. Contemporary therapy, emphasizing authenticity, personal responsibility, and meaning, reflects Kierkegaardian themes throughout. In religious thought, his critique of institutional Christianity and emphasis on personal faith influenced theologians like Barth, Tillich and Bonhoeffer. His insights about indirect communication transformed educational approaches, emphasizing active learning and personal engagement over passive information reception. His analysis of mass society and levelling proved remarkably prescient in anticipating challenges of modern media and consumer culture. Contemporary concerns about social media's impact on individual identity reflect themes he explored in analysing the public and the press. The literary influence extends through major modern writers like Kafka, Dostoevsky and Auden, who drew upon his techniques of indirect communication and insights about anxiety and authentic existence. His emphasis on individual responsibility shaped modern discussions of ethics and political philosophy, influencing approaches to moral education and liberal democratic theory. The relevance of his insights has only increased in our contemporary context of rapid change and cultural uncertainty. His analysis of anxiety as response to unlimited possibilities speaks directly to contemporary choice overload and decision fatigue. Perhaps most significantly, Kierkegaard's ideas provide practical resources for addressing specific challenges of modern life that he could hardly have imagined. His insights about authentic individual choice offer guidance for navigating career decisions, relationship commitments, and life transitions in an age of unprecedented options and mobility. His understanding of anxiety as the dizziness of freedom helps people recognize that their feelings of overwhelm and uncertainty are not personal failures but natural responses to human freedom. His emphasis on subjective truth and personal appropriation provides alternatives to both rigid fundamentalism and relativistic skepticism in approaching questions of meaning and value. Looking toward the future, Kierkegaard's insights about individual versus society, subjective versus objective truth, and temporal versus eternal meaning remain relevant as long as humans face the fundamental challenges he analysed. His work continues attracting new readers seeking resources for contemporary questions about identity, meaning and authentic living. Rather than providing easy answers, his legacy consists in helping each generation formulate better questions and develop more authentic approaches to existence's enduring challenges. His greatest gift may be demonstrating that life's most important questions cannot be answered through abstract theorizing alone, but require the courage to live authentically in an uncertain and demanding world.